Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 220 and I am the show's host Kyle. On today's episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I'm going to be breaking down an interview where Rand Paul went on Jake Tapper's show and they discuss a variety of subjects including Russiagate, Russia aggression, NATO expansion, and then the Trump-Putin summit, which will be happening the day the show's released, Monday, July 16th in Finland. I think in a lot of ways the show, this interview pits Jake Tapper, who represents the foreign policy kind of mainstream establishment think, which is the United States has to be aggressive against all the people in the world who we see as against the natural world order or, kind of not in line with the Western alliances. So this would be Russia, Iran, North Korea, to a lesser extent China, versus Rand Paul, who is more of a non-interventionist. Now, Rand Paul isn't perfect on the issues, and kind of what I want to do in this interview is point out where I think Rand could have been better or offer up more information. And of course, this is, a short interview on a talk show, not a long, in-depth discussion like you're going to have on this show. So I do understand that Rand's a little bit more limited there, but I think he does give a pretty good overall explanation of the non-interventionist position here. And I guess Rand's not a perfect non-interventionist again, but pretty good the way it all plays out. And so I'm giving analysis on it, stuff like that. The interview will be linked at the show notes page, which could be found at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. And of course, while you're, checking out the show notes pages, please share the show, recommend it to friends, family, help the show to grow. Really appreciate it. And I'll go ahead and play the first clip.
Putin summit is causing anxiety among some Republicans, fears that President Trump might give too much away or not be tough enough. But Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, says President Trump's doing the right thing by meeting face-to-face. He sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and joins me now from his home state of Kentucky. Senator Paul, thanks so much for joining us as always. Just 48 hours ago, the U.S. government, the Trump administration, said the top Russian military intelligence officers orchestrated a massive hack to affect the U.S. election. How much do you want President Trump to try to hold Putin accountable for that?
I think really we mistake our response if we think it's about accountability from the Russians. They're another country. They're going to spy on us. They do spy on us. They're going to interfere in our elections. We also do the same. Dov Levin at Carnegie Mellon studied this over about a 50-year period in the last century and found 81 times that the U.S. interfered in other countries' elections. So we all do it. What we need to do is make sure our electoral process is protected. And I think because this has gotten partisan and it's all about partisan politics, we've forgotten that really the most important thing is the integrity of our election. And there are things we can do and things that I've advocated, making sure it's decentralized all the way down to the precinct level, making sure we don't store all the data in one place, even for a state, and that there's a backup way that someone in the precinct can say 2,000 people signed in. This was the vote tally I sent to headquarters. There's a lot of ways we can back up our election. Advertising and things like that, it's tricky. Can we restrict the Russians? We might be able to in some ways, but I think in the bottom line, we've wanted the Russians to admit it. They're not going to admit it the same way we're not going to admit that we were involved in the Ukrainian elections or in the Russian elections. So all countries that can spy do. All countries that want to interfere in elections and have the ability to, they try.
So to start with Tapper's question, he goes first to the same thing that we heard with the Kim Jong-un summit, which is that Trump is going to give up too much to Vladimir Putin, and people are afraid that, including people in Rand's own party, the Republicans. Now, we shouldn't be surprised because, for those of you who are listeners to this show, you know that the foreign policy establishment spans both sides of the aisle, and that, Chuck Schumer, for example, or Hillary Clinton are no better on the war issues than John McCain or Lindsey Graham. And so it's not surprising that we hear people on that side of the aisle saying, oh, we don't want Trump talking to Vladimir Putin because the worst thing in the world would be for Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to get along, because obviously Vladimir Putin's a bad guy, and so whatever he says is going to be bad. And even if he signs on to a deal, it's only going to be to trick the Americans. Now, trying to find a potential downside to talks between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, I think is difficult to find in reality. If you look at the situation between the United States and Russia, the United States is planning on spending what's, I think, already at like $1.3 trillion upgrading our nuclear arsenal in the next 10 to 15 years. And of course, we spend about $1 trillion a year on our military anyway. So we're just planning on spending all this money on our nuclear weapons, and all of this is because Russia has the second largest nuclear arsenal. Now, there have been times in the history between the United States and the USSR or Russia where we've been able to come up with deals with the other country for de-escalation. This, included putting less warheads actually on missiles or in submarines and stuff like that, and just, reducing the overall number of larger nuclear weapons, which was great. And we should return to a situation like that. I mean, these weapons not only are just weapons of genocide, so they really don't, do anybody any good. At very best, they go off. I guess at the very best, they just go to waste and wreak havoc on the environment. But, at worst, we use them and then they kill everybody. But even not being used, they're terrible for the environment. They, create a lot of nuclear waste producing them and stuff like that. And, they're just wasting trillions of dollars of human productivity and labor. And a deal with Russia wouldn't necessarily even be having to limit to Russia. We could expand, to China and other countries around the world. North Korea has certainly signaled that part of their desire for their denuclearization is for other countries to have take the same steps. And so, if we could reduce these weapons, if we could reduce our military spending, our military preparedness, this is better for everybody, because the money spent on self-defense isn't money that, goes to things that could really improve human life, education, food, all that great stuff. Even if it's just spent on consumer goods, at least we have more. Now, I think that, they're going to paint a few catastrophe situations where what Trump is giving away is either recognizing that Russia is the owner of the Crimean Peninsula, allowing Assad to remain in Syria, allowing the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to Europe, or maybe Trump would agree to remove some missile defense systems. So in the first two, the Assad and the Crimea situation, I mean, facts on the ground kind of say that no matter what you think of Assad, he is going to be the man that rules Syria. And if you look back to 2015 when the United States and Russia were getting involved in Syria, the facts on the ground then were, if Assad doesn't rule Syria, then ISIS or Al-Qaeda will. Now, with the situation America is in now in Syria, where we're backing the group, the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, and they're despised by our NATO enemy in Turkey. And so for the United States to facilitate a deal between Putin and Assad with the YPG to come to some kind of reconciliation will allow the United States to exit the Syrian theater, where there's going to be billions, I'm sure hundreds of billions, if not even more, that has to be put towards rebuilding that country. And of course, if the United States is the occupying world power, then we're either going to have to spend, a lot of that money investing in rebuilding, or we're going to end up being, fighting an insurgency there. And, we could withdraw and allow Iran and Russia to, spend their money, their citizens' money in Syria rather than spending our own. And then it also resolves our problem with our, NATO ally Turks hating our, Syrian allies Kurds. And, they're not going to let the Kurds have a state. So who else is going to rule Syria other than Assad at this point? Crimea, the problem is that Russia now owns the Crimean Peninsula. I've gotten into this on past episodes of the show, and, I think it's a more nuanced situation than Russia just stole the Crimean Peninsula. But even if you think that, the fact is that Russia now owns it and they're not giving it back. And so you could say, well, we're not going to have normal relations with Russia until Russia gives back the Crimean Peninsula. But in that case, you're just never going to have normalized relations with Russia, and you lose out on all the positives. So you're kind of just shooting yourself in the foot. With the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, this will allow Russia to directly ship, I think it's liquefied natural gas, but it may be other, kind of carbon-based fuels, to Germany from Russia. This would be a huge boon to, Germany and the Western Europeans being able to easily import these, fuels. I'm sure it would help to bring down fuel prices and just make everybody in Germany and probably the west of Western Europe all that much more wealthy. But from the American standpoint, this means that our, Western European allies are slightly less reliant on the Americans. And for people like Jay Tapper, who have this worldview where America has to be the ones that dictate and run everything, even though they grandstand and, pretend that Donald Trump's the ultimate racist, really think that they have to be the ones that, have leverage over everybody else so we could tell them how they need to act, which is completely ridiculous. But this is kind of the argument here, that why we can't allow the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to be completed, because it moves Russia closer to our allies. The last thing I would guess they would talk about is the missile defense systems. People possibly being worried that Donald Trump would agree to remove our missile defense from Poland or, South Korea, Guam, or something like that. I see it being pretty unlikely Trump being willing to do this, but if he was willing to do that, then it could only help to warm tensions between the U.S. and Russia anyways, but maybe getting Putin to then agree to either removing a nuclear submarine, doing some kind of reciprocal effort would be a great kind of thing. Now, Rand Paul's responses here, I think, are pretty good. He talks about how, look, the situation. So then the question, Tapper, finally to get into that, dreads towards Rand Paul is about Russiagate. And now the big news on Russiagate is Friday we have Donald Trump meeting with the Queen of England, and the Mueller probe puts out this indictment of 12 Russians who are members of the GRU, which is the Russian Central Intelligence Agency, claiming that these members of the GRU undermined the United States election by hacking into the DNC servers, stealing Hillary Clinton's emails, and then funneling them to WikiLeaks. Now, within this indictment, they don't provide any evidence, and they do not have any ties to the actual Trump campaign. I think this is, I'm going to just go ahead and get into the kind of Russiagate stuff with this probe now. I read a couple good articles, one by Daniel Lazare, one by Moon of Alabama, and then another one by Ray McGovern and Bill Binney, and I'll link to all three of those in the show notes page. But in those articles, they lay out the fact that, these are all Russians who live in Russia. I'm not sure if these are actual members of the GRU. The Russians denied that they were, but I'm sure they are going to do that anyways. As I said before, there's no evidence in the actual indictment. Now, the interesting thing would be is that if one of these people did come to the United States and end up facing trial, then they would have the right to discovery. And so this could create a lot of problems for the Mueller probe, as any evidence they have may be tied to, the NSA mass surveillance programs and stuff like that. And so, they may end up having to give out a lot more information than they want. There's several different kinds of charges, but the basic thing they're accused of are buying a server in the United States with cryptocurrencies that I believe was based in Arizona, and then using that server to hack into the DNC emails, get those emails, either give them to Glucifer or were posing as Glucifer, that's 2.0, to get WikiLeaks to go ahead and access those emails and give them out. So, this is the claim. As I said so far, we don't have evidence of it. The McGovern and Binney article does some pretty good analysis on Glucifer 2.0, who I don't know if that's an actual Russian agent. That part I haven't seen any evidence for, and Glucifer has been talked about a lot now. The other issue here, of course, is that they're using information from CrowdStrike, which is the organization that the DNC gave their servers to and allowed them to, do the forensics to determine that was the Russians who hacked into their servers. Now, this is very interesting because if somebody breaks into my house, I can't then take the evidence from my house, give it to the police, and then tell them that this is the evidence they have to go on. There's supposed to be an impartial third party that comes in and evaluates the evidence, but that didn't happen at all in this situation. And it should be a real problem. And it should be somebody like Jake Tapper should be asking Mueller about that. Like, what's going on with CrowdStrike here? I believe the founder or the head of CrowdStrike is actually on the Atlantic Council, which has an anti-Russia bias. So, there's a lot of problems with CrowdStrike. There's a lot of problems with this investigation that they have going on. End up indicting these 12 people who everybody can see. Even Jake Tapper will probably never actually face trial. So it's more of a political thing. And that's kind of what Rand Paul gets into. And I think the strongest point Rand makes here is that every country does this, right? The United States has interfered in elections. He points to two key ones. One was under the Obama administration, the election in Russia. Now, I don't know if there's a whole lot of concern that, Vladimir Putin could actually lose that election, but what Rand is referring to here is that the United States funnels money to NGOs, which are supposed to be non-governmental organizations, but something like the National Endowment for Democracy will go overseas and then prop up candidates who are opposing the people in power who the United States doesn't like. And so, this is something that obviously Vladimir Putin had a problem with. Is the Americans interfering in the Russian election. Even more so 2014 in Ukraine. We helped to organize that coup d'etat and overthrow the Ukrainian elected government that was democratically elected and put a new government in control. And so, you could go all the way back to the 50s and look at what the United States did in Iran. You could look at the various coups and support for whatever different militant groups or government organizations throughout Central and South America or the Middle East over the years. But we certainly play a large role in a lot of elections. And then Rand says, well, every country does this. And, this is one thing that I think is an important part of Russiagate is that, maybe the Russians did look into hack into Hillary Clinton's email server. Hell, if, they were convinced like everybody else was at the time that she was going to win the election, then that would be very vital information. It would make absolute sense that they would want it from an intelligence standpoint, not necessarily to help her to lose that election. And so, I guess it's possible that the Russians hacked in. However, we still haven't seen the evidence for that. And, there's still the lack of evidence of any collusion with the Russian government or that the Russians gave the information to WikiLeaks. Another important note is that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has offered to give the CIA evidence that it actually wasn't Russia that hacked those emails and then gave them to the United States. But thus far, the United States has refused that information from Julian Assange. Rand does make the point that I think it's a good one that, the more decentralized the election is, because all different countries are going to try to meddle and hack into other countries' elections. You could score big points if, you're somebody or if you're a different country and you could get the United States candidate elected that has a more favorable position towards you or your country. It could mean, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in aid. It could mean that you're allowed to build new pipelines or get new weapons. And so there's a huge advantage to having a sympathetic president to you in the White House. And so we could and should expect that other governments will attempt to influence our elections just like we do to other governments. And I think all you can really do, and kind of what Rand says, is just decentralize and be aware. I'll go ahead and play the second clip.
It sounds as though you are saying that the United States has done the equivalent of what the Russians did in the 2016 election, and it might sound to some viewers that you're offering that statement as an excuse for what the Russians did.
No, what I would say is it's not morally equivalent, but I think in their mind it is. And I think it's important to know in your adversary's mind the way they perceive things. I do think that they react to our interference in both their elections. They were one of the reasons they really didn't like Hillary Clinton is they found her responsible for some of the activity by the U.S. in their elections under the Obama administration.
Yeah. Okay, go on.
I'm not saying they're equivalent or morally equivalent, but I am saying that this is the way the Russians respond. So if you want to know how we have better diplomacy or better reactions, we have to know their response. But it's not just interference in elections that I think has caused this nationalism in Russia. Also, I think part of the reason is we promised them when James Baker at the end, when Germany reunified, we promised them that we wouldn't go 1 inch eastward of Germany with NATO, and we've crept up on the borders. We still have neocons in both parties who want Ukraine and Georgia to be in NATO. That's very, very provocative, and it has stimulated and encouraged nationalism in Russia. George Kennan predicted this. In 1998, when we still had Yeltsin and Russia was still coming in our direction, he said, if you push NATO up against Russia's borders, nationalism will arise and their militaristic tendencies will increase, and you may get someone like a Putin, basically. George Kennan predicted the rise of Putin in 1998. And so we have to understand that for every action we have, there is a reaction. And it's a big mistake for us not to say that we're morally equivalent or anything Russia does is justified. But if we don't realize that everything we do has a reaction, we're not going to be very good at understanding and trying to have peace in our world.
So Tapper takes Rand's pretty good point that, look, everybody interferes in other people's elections. See, the United States has done it before, to basically then make it into a straw man and say, Rand Paul, you're saying that what the United States does is equivalent to what the evil Vladimir Putin does? And Rand says, I never said that in the first place, although I think Rand should have fired back and said, no, what the United States done has been far worse. We've propped up ruthless dictators. We have, overthrown governments and destabilized countries. I mean, if you look at what happened in Ukraine, it was our intervention in their government that provoked a civil war to take place in that country and 10,000 people die. But, I mean, Rand does defend his position and say, look, that's not what I'm saying at all. But if you look at it from the, Russian perspective, that is, kind of what they see it as. And he doesn't use the term blowback, but he's basically explaining blowback here, saying, look, you have to understand how your enemies or whoever else are going to react to your actions, because there is going to be a reaction. And if, now it's predictable that if the United States intervenes somewhere, Russia is also going to intervene, especially if it's in a country around their border or one key to their security. So think of Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria. And if the United States meddles, that Russia may push back and then take a little bit more. So if you look at what happened in Ukraine, they haven't annexed the Donbas, even though a majority of Ukrainians who live in that area of Ukraine want to, be annexed and join the Russian Federation. However, they did take the Crimean Peninsula, which is military strategic to them. The United States meddled around in Georgia. This is back in the 2000s. Russia ends up taking a small portion of Georgia. And then in Syria, the United States certainly backed groups that ended up turning into Al-Qaeda and ISIS and nearly overthrowing the Assad regime. And so now Russia has a much more powerful and prominent role as Syria's main ally. But this was all in reaction to U.S., actions overseas. Jake Tapper even says the United States has never done what Russia did. This is completely ridiculous. I guess, the United States maybe has never done the specifics of what Russia did in this case, but we certainly interfered and meddled in elections far more significantly than what Russia is alleged to have done in the United States. And remember, as much as people want to blame Russia and the leaked DNC emails, the fact is that they're true. And so even if Russia did do what Jake Clapper is claiming that they did, they exposed that Hillary Clinton was a fraud and was crooked, and that the DNC passed her the debate questions before the debates with her and Bernie Sanders, giving her a very, very strong edge by doing that. And they really undermined his entire campaign and made sure that she won. So if anybody rigged an election here, it was the DNC. And if Russia did anything, all they did is expose it. Now here Rand Paul brings up a couple more important issues. The first being NATO expansion, saying how, look, at the end of the Cold War, Germany reunified and the United States said to Russia, we're not going to move NATO past Germany. And that was the deal. And then we expanded to Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Montenegro, Macedonia just got an invitation. All of these countries, even Turkey, which, ventures into Asia, is now a part of NATO. And NATO has really, really expanded past where the United States agreed that it wouldn't expand. But Jake Tapper never really addresses that point either, that the United States went back on a promise that we made Russia 30 years ago now, 20 to 30. And so again, Rand Paul, without saying blowback, does a very good job of pointing out that, look, we can now anticipate that if we continue to expand NATO, if we continue to meddle in these countries that are allies with Russia, we could expect reactions from Russia. I'll go ahead and play the next clip.
To underline this point about what the United States should do in response to the Russian election interference, in a new interview just this morning, President Trump said he, quote, hadn't thought of asking Putin to extradite those 12 Russian military intelligence officers. Do you think President Trump should ask for the extradition when they meet tomorrow?
I think it'd be a moot point. I don't think Russia's sending anyone back over here for trial, the same way we wouldn't send anybody over there for trial. No country with any sovereignty or sense of sovereignty is sending anybody to another country for trial. I think we have to protect ourselves. So because we waste time saying, well, Putin needs to admit this and apologize, he's not going to admit that he did it, and we can't take with on face value anything they tell us. We have to assume, and if we have proof that they did it, which it sounds like we did, we should now spend our time protecting ourselves instead of sort of having this witch hunt on the president. If the president was involved, by all means, put the information forward. There is no evidence so far of the president's involvement at all in this, so I think we need to be done with this so we can start actually protecting our elections from foreign countries.
So Tapper starts this question by asking, should Trump ask Putin to extradite the 12 people that were indicted? Now, I had the same reaction that Rand did, which was, Putin wouldn't do that, so why even ask? I think Rand doesn't go into, this could be a little bit more serious, though. if the United States is going in and asking, Trump keeps starting off with things that he knows Putin's not going to agree to, well, it's a little bit of a poison pill for the negotiations. It's not the kind of thing that really is going to help to facilitate a good relationship between the United States and Russia. And so Rand should have said, no, Trump shouldn't ask that because it's not going to happen. And then he does a good job of going on to explain why, which is we wouldn't extradite Americans to Russia. Certainly you could probably find some Americans who were involved in the coup in Ukraine. Look at Victoria Nuland, who was actually caught on a video or on a phone call, saying F the EU and that, saying who the next ruler of Ukraine was going to be. So there's certainly no reason to think that Russia would extradite these people. So again, there's no point in asking whatsoever, and doing so is just something that the foreign policy establishment seems to be doing to try to, hurt relations between Trump and Putin however possible. Rand does also a good job of saying this is just like the other issues involving Russiagate. If Russia isn't going to admit to it, and you're not going to believe them when they say no, so what's even the point of asking? I think Rand does a poor job of, kind of seeing that, well, it seems like the evidence says Russia did it. Unless Rand knows something that I don't. The evidence out there does not say that Russia did it. Move on to the next clip.
Well, you just called this a witch hunt, but if it were not for this probe, if it were not for Robert Mueller, the American people would not know about the Russian military intelligence officers who were hacking American emails, stealing voter information, releasing stolen information to influence the election. I'm not sure how you can call it a witch hunt. Isn't it a good thing that this probe has continued?
I would say that this is a Department of Justice investigation and that would still have ensued in either way. I wish President Obama had been more aggressive in pursuing it during President Obama's term, but I think the Department of Justice can get to the bottom of this without sort of a special counsel. I think the Mueller investigation, the problem with these special counsels is exactly what happened in the Starr investigation, and that is that they run far afield of it. People are threatened with life in prison for tax evasion. And so what happens is you end up spending years and years and millions of dollars. And I think that in the end, it's too enormous of a governmental power. Can you imagine, if every businessman or woman in the U.S., if we went back through 30 years history of them and nitpicked every one of their tax returns, what we could do to every individual if the full power of the government came after them? And then if we took every individual that worked for them and threatened them with life in prison if they had made a tax violation, I think we'd live in a world that nobody would really like or appreciate at that point. So I'm very much against these special counsels, but I do think the Department of Justice would have investigated the Russians, and I think indicting these officers that were hacking the elections is a good thing.
So I almost didn't include this clip just because there's a lot of political stuff in there that I think is like kind of silly, and you really don't even need to talk about. Rand saying, well, if Obama had done more, and, kind of talking about if the witch hunt is the right word to use. However, I think I want to answer Tapper's question, which is, why isn't the probe a good thing if we're finding all this out? And the unfortunate part is that the probe actually hasn't released any real evidence linking in any way Russia to the DNC emails or the Trump administration to Russia. So in that case, they've done a whole lot of indicting people. And as Rand Paul points out, and he says, this could get way out of hand and people could start getting indicted for all kinds of ridiculous things, which is so far what's happened, where it's been Michael Flynn acting as a lobbyist for Turkey and not declaring himself. That's what got him caught up. For Manafort and Gates, it was their past dealings that were illegal, kind of tax evasion, Fitzer, corruption type of stuff. And so, the people that are going down aren't people that are going down for reasons related to the actual campaign and election. I think Rand gets probably a little hyperbolic with it, but I would have just gone on to point out from Rand Paul's perspective that, look, you have used this investigation to, undermine the legitimacy of Donald Trump's election and use it to make Donald Trump have a more difficult time trying to negotiate with the Russians and even with Kim Jong-un, because the Russiagate stuff was getting brought up then, saying that Donald Trump was only doing this on behalf of Vladimir Putin. And so basically they've undermined Donald Trump's best foreign policy tendencies with this Russiagate narrative. Now, I'm not saying that Donald Trump would have made good or better decisions had it not been there, but it certainly hasn't helped at all. That's good.
This week, the Senate, I want to talk about NATO now because you brought it up. This week, the Senate voted 97-2 in favor of a motion that supports the NATO alliance. This was a non-binding motion expressing the Senate's support for NATO, calling on negotiators to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to NATO. You were one of the two in the 97-2. You voted against it. There is consensus that NATO has served an essential role in stabilizing Europe, which ultimately has prevented the United States to need to take military action and to also check Russian aggression. You talked about how NATO has moved closer and closer towards the Russian border. A lot of experts say that's because Russia has continued to expand and take territory in Ukraine, in Crimea, in Georgia. Do you support NATO?
I think it's sort of chicken and the egg. Which happens first, either NATO's expansion or Russia's pushing back or vice versa. I will say that when you look at NATO, what I voted against was an ironclad commitment to defend any nation in NATO, and they also said that they want an open door policy in NATO to admit any aspirant. So I think that is very foolhardy to say we're going to defend any country in the world that wants to be in NATO, and we're inviting any country that meets the requirements to come into NATO. That is a recipe for disaster, and no thinking foreign policy expert would have voted for this if they realized that we're having an open-ended commitment to whoever wants to join NATO and an ironclad commitment. I think it dilutes the value of NATO. NATO has had historic achievements and has been part of what was deterrence to Russia. But the interesting thing now is that European forces are 13 times bigger than Russian forces. European plus U.S. forces are probably 30 times bigger than Russia's forces. So right now, there's a disproportionate advantage to the West with NATO. I'm not saying we disband NATO, but I don't think we should have an open door policy. I think, for example, going to war over putting Albania in or putting Montenegro in or particularly putting Ukraine or Georgia in would be a disaster. And that's what the neoconservatives are advocating for. They have been agitating for years, and I've been blocking them, is putting Georgia in. Russia's in Georgia right now. For better or worse, they are there. It is right on their border. We would be at war with Russia right now if Georgia were in NATO. So people need to think through these things before they get so eager to rattle their sabers about, wanting to have a confrontation with Russia. We spent 70 years trying not to have a confrontation.
So the next clip, Jay Tapper sets up by citing this vote that was a non-binding resolution, so it's more of a spirit of the Senate vote on NATO. What that vote was doing was saying that it would endorse the United States commitment to Article 5 of NATO, which is the Mutual Defense Pact. If any NATO country gets attacked, then all the NATO allies go along with them. There's even been talks about expanding this to cyber attacks, so the United States could get itself involved in cyber or, I guess, hot warfare if another NATO member country gets hacked. But it would also create the United States endorsing an open door policy for NATO, as Rand Paul describes it, meaning that if countries meet the membership thresholds for NATO, then the United States feels those countries should enter NATO. And essentially, this would allow two countries in particular, Georgia and Ukraine, to enter NATO. Now, Russia has drawn the red line and said, this is something that we will go to war over. We're not going to let Georgia or NATO, two countries that sit on our border, to enter into the NATO alliance. These countries are located very close to the majority of Russia's population, very close to the capital city of Moscow. And so from a tactical and strategic advantage, obviously there's no way that Russia will allow those countries to enter NATO. But then Jay Tapper cites and says, look, NATO has this role in stabilizing Europe, and then kind of conflates this with the Russia aggression narrative and say that, all the experts agree that NATO was good for stabilizing Europe. And I'm not sure how true that is, but at the very least, during we made it through the Cold War without nuclear warfare or without the Soviet Union invading Western Europe. And so I guess you can't deny that the NATO alliance was probably useful in that regard, but the Soviet Union has since disintegrated. As Rand Paul points out in his answer, the European militaries are far more powerful than the Russian military is at this point, aside from having the nuclear weapons, which France and the UK also have a couple hundred nuclear weapons themselves. Russia really doesn't have an advantage over the European countries. And so I guess, Rand Paul doesn't go through and make the point, but he should have said, look, Europe is not under a threat from Russia. Now, Jay Tapper points out that with the Russia aggression narrative, Russia is expanding outside of its own borders. And, the only point you could point to this is, of course, the Crimean Peninsula in a small area of Georgia where Russia has moved in and taken that territory. However, both of these interventions by Russia followed Western interventions in these countries and followed massive NATO expansion. Rand Paul gets into talking about chicken and the egg and how it's clear that Russia is reacting to America by taking these actions, and it's not the other way around. And if you look at NATO expansion, it has been going on since the mid-1990s under Bill Clinton, so it's very clear. And it's very easy to see who's expanding where. NATO was never supposed to expand past Germany. Poland is now a member of NATO. The United States now has massive armaments in Poland. And so it's amazing to me that Jay Tapper has no ability to see and is so caught up in the mainstream establishment foreign policy thought that he can't even realize that, hey, the Russians here may not be the aggressors in this situation. It may be the United States and NATO. I'm going to go ahead and play the last clip.
I just think there are a lot of people out there who would be surprised to hear a sitting United States Senator describe Russia versus NATO in terms of confrontation and expansion as a chicken or egg proposition, given the fact that NATO protects sovereign countries while allowing them to remain sovereign, while Russia invades other countries and takes over those countries. I don't think it's
right.
Chicken or the egg.
Well, what I would say is that there were people, probably the greatest diplomat of the last century was George Kennan, and he did predict as NATO expanded that you would incite militaristic tendencies and nationalism in Russia. I'm not justifying Russia's aggression in Ukraine or in Georgia. I'm not saying they are equivalent. I am saying, though, that the provocation of pushing NATO forward after we promised, James Baker promised Gorbachev in 1990 when Germany unified that the West would not go 1 inch beyond Germany. And yet, a couple years later, under the Clinton administration, we kept pushing. And so for every action that we put out there is a reaction. And I think we need to think this through. And it's not a moral equivalency. It's not justifying Russia's behavior, but it is realizing that from Russia's perspective, they see NATO expansion as a threat and that part of their militarism and part of their nationalism may be inherent to the tides of the current century there, but it's also in reaction to policy from the West as well.
So, Jay Tapper starts and he's in disbelief. Tom Woods talks about the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. And apparently on that 3x5 card of allowable opinion, you cannot have the position that NATO expansion upset Russia, which is unbelievable and shows just how little the foreign policy establishment either doesn't understand about the situation with Russia or is just dishonest. And I'm not sure what camp Jay Tapper falls in. I would guess it's the doesn't understand, cognitive limitations or whatever. But he does portray NATO as this great ambivalent power that is just out there to let everybody be free in who they want to be. And yet you just had the NATO summit a couple weeks ago and Donald Trump trying to force all these countries to spend more on their military than they want to. You do lose sovereignty entering the NATO alliance. You enter the mutual defense path. That means if another country goes to war, you have to go to war with them. They have to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. And so countries do give up sovereignty to enter the NATO alliance. Jay Tapper also makes it sound like Russia is expanding and reinstituting the old USSR. That's simply not the case. Again, it's a couple hundred square miles total that Russia has expanded, and while NATO has expanded all the way to Russia's border. I mean, look at Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Montenegro, Macedonia will be the next country who can't even have the sovereignty of picking their own name if they want to enter NATO thanks to the Greeks. Greece is another country that's joined in NATO. So you can see that NATO keeps expanding, and this is, something that Rand Paul apparently is the only person within the Senate that is able to see is a threat to Russia. Russia sees this as a threat, and the NATO alliance is distinctly opposed to Russia, so this does make sense. overall, I thought Rand did a pretty good job with the interview. Again, there were a couple concessions that I would have made. There's a couple points where I think he should have expanded, but overall, great bringing up the question. I think it gave me an excellent opportunity to cover the Trump-Putin summit, the new revelations from the Mueller probe, or the new indictments, I guess, not really revelations, just new political games played by the Mueller probe. I would add on that it would be very interesting if Putin ends up extraditing one or two of these people to the United States to face trial, and then they do get discovery. Because, you assume that if Mueller does have evidence that he's just not showing, this evidence probably has to do with the NSA Bolt spying programs. And so here, this kind of come back to shoot the FBI and the U.S. spy apparatus in the foot. If, they make all these demands for extradition, assuming that they're not going to be extradited, and then they end up, extraditing them and getting discovery. This happened with the Internet Research Company, which is a Russian organization that was indicted under earlier round from the Mueller investigation. And then, they came to the U.S. and were like, well, we want discovery. How'd you get this information? And then the Mueller probe asked for an extension on that. They didn't want to give it. And so it's very interesting how this all ends up playing out. I do think that, the talks are a good thing. Hopefully they end up positive, and the foreign policy establishment types like Jay Tapper, Hillary Clinton, and John McCain, continue to hopefully phase themselves out of our society and our foreign policy groupthink, and we can move closer and closer to a more peaceful world. That's where I'll sign off on today's show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. Immersion News is the news website. If you really like the show and you really want to help out, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. The show's growing every single week, almost is a better week than the last one. I'm hitting and breaking the goals I set for this show, and a lot of that is because y'all are supporting the show. I got some new exciting developments to come, including this theme song, or I guess an intro music that should be out in the next week or so. So look forward to that, and I hope you all will keep coming back and sharing the show and doing all those things that helps it to grow.